Francis Morrone.
Thank you, everybody. My subject is the history of this neighborhood. Very few people said no-ho when I first moved to New York, but people had recently begun saying Soho, and so I guess it was just a matter of time before no-ho also came into use. Today, the name has sort of been given an official sanction, if you will, by the New York City Landmarks Preservation Commission, which has designated a no-ho historic district, a district which, in fact, since its original designation in 1999, has been twice enlarged. And so we are situated within the no-ho historic district, a very large district, but the neighborhood that I'm going to be talking about tonight is really just a small subset of Greater NoHo. I want to talk about the blocks between roughly Great Jones and Astor Place, well, let's say 8th Street, and the Bowery and Broadway, focusing on Lafayette Street, or Lafayette Place, as a portion of it was originally called. It's a storied neighborhood. There are a lot of very famous buildings in the neighborhood. A lot of famous New York personages have resided in this neighborhood. But I think that there's always something more to say about it. And what interests me particularly, not just about this, but about any neighborhood in any city, is how it changes over time. And this is something that I think we're all going to be thinking a lot about throughout 2015. As Anthony said, this is the 50th anniversary of the landmarks law in New York. It's also a good occasion for all of us to think about what this means. Think about what are historic districts all about. And as we look at the history of any historic district, something that we find is that it's a place that has, this is usually the case, has changed considerably over time. This then is the paradox of historic preservation, that we seek to preserve something that became so special by changing so much over a period of time. Any neighborhood has many distinct phases in its history, and no one of those phases is really the phase. Here is John Jacob Astor. He's a fairly pleasant-looking man in this picture. He was the richest man in America at the time he died in 1848. In fact, according to the historians who study this sort of thing, he would today, in adjusted dollars, probably rank as the 4th or 5th richest American who ever lived. In other words, in today's dollars, Astor's fortune at the time of his death in 1848 would be greater than the fortunes of Bill Gates, or Warren Buffett, or Carlos Slim. He was very, very rich. A lot of people associate Astor with the fur trade. If you go into the Astor Place subway station, what do you see? In terracotta, the beavers, right? But in fact, that was only his initial fortune. That's what made him the money that he was then able to invest. And what did John Jacob Astor invest in? Manhattan real estate. So when you look at the biggest fortunes in American history, you have Rockefeller, oil. You have Carnegie, steel. You have Vanderbilt, railroads. And then you have Astor, Manhattan real estate. And it was enough, you know, for the 5th or 6th biggest fortune in our history. Well, Astor owned more of Manhattan Island than any other individual. He owned the land where we're sitting right now. And once upon a time, a man named Joseph Delacroix leased a portion of this land, bounded by Broadway and the Bowery, and Great Jones and Astor Place, and leased it from Astor around 1805 or so. And on the land created something called Vauxhall Garden or Vauxhall Gardens, after the Vauxhall Gardens in London. I apologize for this one meager image of Vauxhall Garden, but in fact there are very, very few illustrations available of what Vauxhall Garden looked like. It was a pleasure garden, as they were called in New York at the time. At a time when there was as yet no public parks movement, thus no, public parks, there were these private parks, pleasure grounds, that people, that were privately owned and operated, but that functioned, for all intents and purposes, like public parks. People could go into these pleasure gardens and they could walk along tree-shaded lanes, and they could picnic, and they could buy an ice cream cone or do all of the things that you do in a park. And this was a large one. It was located north of the populous centers of the city at the time, and it occupied this fairly large acreage. However, Astor, as he realized the city was moving northward and this land was going to be more and more valuable for residential development, decided that he was going to build a new street, a residential street, right through the middle of Vauxhall Garden. Vauxhall Garden continued in operation, though reduced in size. And the street that Astor cut through in the year 1826 was Lafayette Place, not Lafayette Street. It would not acquire that name for another 80 or so years. Lafayette Place, it extended only from Great Jones Street on the south to Astor Place on the north. That was the original Lafayette Place. It did not extend, it dead-ended at Great Jones Street. It did not extend south of there. And Astor had the idea that Lafayette Place would be this elegant abode of the rich in New York. In fact, Astor's son and principal legatee William Backhouse Astor lived on Lafayette Place. This was William Backhouse Astor's house at 32 Lafayette Place. Of course, the numbers are all completely different now, but this was immediately to the south of the building that is now the Public Theater. It actually adjoined it on the south. The house is long gone, but it was a stately, simple Greek Revival house. You would not necessarily look at this house and think, my goodness, the richest man in America, as in fact William Backhouse Astor, after his father lives in this house, because back then there was a lot less ostentation in the homes of the rich than there would be a few decades later. In any event, the presence of William Backhouse Astor on this street was all the indication that anybody needed that this was the street to live on. In 1832-33, this splendid row of houses was built right across the street from William Backhouse Astor's townhouse. It was called LaGrange Terrace. LaGrange Terrace on Lafayette Place. Mind you, Lafayette Place was cut through by Astor in 1826, which was right after the triumphant visit to America of the Marquis de Lafayette. He was all Americans' favorite non-American. Because without Lafayette, we would not be here. No man ever attended as many banquets in such a short period of time as Lafayette did when he visited America. And so Astor named Lafayette Place after the Marquis de Lafayette. And Lagrange Terrace was named after Lagrange, which was the country estate of the Marquis de Lafayette in France. People tend to call this Colonnade Row. However, I prefer not to. Colonnade Row is actually the type of development that it was. There were colonnade rows all over the city. That's when you place individual row houses behind this continuous colonnade, which lends a kind of grandeur to the row that it wouldn't otherwise have. There were colonnade rows in Brooklyn, for instance. It was marble. The Corinthian columns were quite majestic. You have to remember that when this was built, it was simply one of the grandest and most imposing things, building developments of any kind, residential or otherwise, in New York City at the time. It had a tremendous fame as a result. And it filled up with some of the most distinguished families in the city. For instance, this house right here, which is still standing at 432 Lafayette Street, part of Lagrange Terrace, was the home of Franklin Delano and of his wife Laura Astor. Laura Astor was the daughter of William Backhouse Astor, and thus the granddaughter of the great John Jacob Astor. And Franklin Delano was the brother of Warren Delano, who also lived in Lagrange Terrace, though in one of the Lagrange Terrace houses that was torn down. He was the maternal grandfather of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Just to give you a sense of the neighborhood's change, after they'd lived in Lagrange Terrace for a while, Franklin and Laura moved to 190 Madison Avenue, which was the west side of Madison between 34th and 35th Streets. Murray Hill, in other words. So that was the pattern of movement in New York at the time. The people who lived on Lafayette Place and its adjoining streets in the 1830s and 40s moved in the 1850s to Murray Hill. That was the move you made. Anyway, here we see the original Lagrange Terrace, which was 9 houses. But as you are all aware, 5 of those 9 houses were demolished in 1917. If you look here on the left side of the screen, you see the warehouse. This bland warehouse that adjoins Lagrange Terrace was built by the John Wanamaker department store that was once located in the building that now holds Kmart. And so it was John Wanamaker that demolished 5 of the 9 Lagrange Terrace houses. It's an amazing thing that what remains, which is less than half of what was originally there, should still, even in its state of advanced decomposition today, still be such an impressive sight. And it is. It's impossible to walk past this without stopping and looking at it and admiring it. So imagine if it were new and if it were more than twice as long as it is today. It really was probably one of the grandest things ever built in New York City. Then, right across the street from it is the other most famous building on Lafayette Place. Though you can see from the dates of this structure, 1849 to 53, that it was built right at the point when this neighborhood was really beginning to change. What happened is that well-to-do New Yorkers were always seeking greener pastures, meaning quieter, cleaner, safer pastures. Thus, they would move to the sort of like the next place that lay just outside of the densely built up city. But as the city caught up, then the people with the means to do so, particularly in the 19th century when infectious disease was such a scourge of city life, would pack up and move farther north. And so the history of the development of New York City is really the city chasing the rich northward up Manhattan Island. And any rich neighborhood generally had its, rich heyday for maybe 20 years. And that was it. And then the neighborhood would undergo changes. Sometimes the neighborhood then became home to institutions that were founded by the rich who had formerly lived there. An example of that would be the Astor Library. So at a point when the Astors were no longer living in Lafayette Place, the son of William Backhouse Astor, John Jacob Astor III, moved to Fifth Avenue and 33rd Street. But the Astor name would remain forever indelibly associated with Lafayette Place, because the one and only great public benefaction of the original John Jacob Astor was the Astor Library. Astor left $400,000 for the establishment of a private library, because it was privately owned and operated, but it was open to the public. And so, in that sense, it was the public library of New York long before there was such a thing as the New York Public Library. The force behind the Astor Library was Joseph Cogswell, a man who got to know John Jacob Astor through a fellow named Samuel Ward. This was Samuel Ward's house. It was on the northeast corner of Broadway and Bond Street. It was built in the 1830s. Samuel Ward was a banker. He was a founder of NYU, and he was an original trustee of the Astor Library. Joseph Cogswell, together with his friend George Bancroft, founded a short-lived school in Northampton, Massachusetts, called the Round Hill School. Samuel Ward, one of whose children, by the way, was Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic, sent his sons to that school and developed a very close relationship with Joseph Cogswell. When Cogswell's school went out of business, Ward invited Cogswell to come and live in his house on Broadway and Bond Street. Then Ward introduced Cogswell to his good friend John Jacob Astor, who had asked Ward for his advice on what he could give money to in his will. And Ward thought Cogswell would have some good ideas about this. And Cogswell had a splendid idea. He said, "Give the money to me so that I can start a public library in New York." And that is precisely what Astor did. So Joseph Cogswell was the founder of the Astor Library, using this $400,000 bequest from Astor. Now, the Astor Library was designed by Alexander Seltzer, an architect who was an immigrant from the Duchy of Baden in Germany, which is also where John Jacob Astor was from. And Seltzer, being a German architect, naturally designed in a Germanic style. By this time, 1875, the Astor Library was the largest library in America. It was about 25% larger than the library at Harvard University. It was twice as large as the Library of Congress. And it was, in fact, the de facto National Library. All official records were sent to the Astor Library. It had a tremendous collection. By the 1890s, some 300,000 volumes, which by the standards at that time was an enormous library. And it, of course, as you all know, formed the nucleus of the New York Public Library. That's why the Astor Library left Lafayette Place, though its building did not. You had to be 14 years old to use the Astor Library. Later, that age was raised to 16. The 14 and 15-year-olds were just too much. Cogswell really lamented how the teenagers who used the library read nothing but trash. And as examples, he gave the novels of Sir Walter Scott and Charles Dickens. So, you know, our views of these things alter over time, don't they? The Astor Library was designed in this Germanic, Romanesque style, and it was modeled after the Staatsbibliothek in Munich, the state library designed by the great Friedrich von Gartner. It wasn't an exact copy, but obviously it was very, very close in design and spirit. But another thing that you'll notice about the Astor Library, which is of course today the Public Theater, is that it was built in 3 distinct phases. The first section that was built was the farthest south section, which was built between 1849 and 53 by Alexander Seltzer. Then the central section was added between 1856 and 59 by the architect Griffith Thomas. And then the northern section was added in the between 1879 and 81 by the architect Thomas Stent, who then made a few modifications to the rest of the structure, such as adding that top story to the central section to kind of bring all the parts together. But notice how each section was so perfectly joined to what was there already that you can't tell. You just can't tell that one part was built in one decade and another part was built in another. Now, as we proceed south on Lafayette Place, there is another building that is associated with a great, if you will, literary institution. In this case, the Devine Press. This is the Devine Press building. It's right at the corner. It is one of the greatest buildings in New York City, in my opinion. It's an industrial building. It's a very rugged building, but it has the ruggedness and the grandeur and the presence of the great Roman aqueducts, in my opinion. It was designed by Babcock and Willard, the same architects who designed the Andrew Carnegie Mansion that is now the Cooper Hewitt Museum, built in the late 1880s, and it housed the printing company that was founded and owned by the great Theodore Lowe Devine. As great a name in the history of American printing as there is, Devine was both a fine printer and a great historian of printing. He was one of the founders of the Grolier Club, and for many years its president. And his company, Devine Press, in that building, right at the corner here, was notable for printing the most beautiful magazines, American magazines of its time, such as Scribner's Magazine and The Century, with their beautiful typefaces and their beautiful woodcut illustrations. Devine was also the commissioner of a whole series of typefaces known as the Century typefaces that were created for the Century magazine and for the books that the Century Publishing Company put out, and was himself, in fact, the co-designer of Century Roman. A number of very well-known typefaces came out of the Devine Press. This is the Century Dictionary, which was one of 1911. This was printed right at the corner, and it was about as beautiful a book of its kind as has ever been printed in this country. And if you go to the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., in the second floor corridors, you look up and there are all the printer's marks in the ceiling. One of the 56 printer's marks which appears in the Library of Congress is that of the Devine Press. Many of the workers at Devine Press were women. This is a very hazy image of women at work at the Devine Press in 1890, and there is the great Devine Press building. There were also on Lafayette Place, needless to say, going back to the residential heyday, a number of notable churches. Right at the corner of Lafayette Place and 4th Street, the northwest corner, right across the street from the Devine Press building, there was Isaiah Rogers's Middle Dutch Reformed Church. It was a very curious church, and this is the only, if anybody has images of this other than this, I'd love to see them. This is the only picture of this church I have ever seen. And what we see here is a Greek temple, but with a high Protestant spire sticking out of the middle of it. A really weird combination of things, and it was evidently considered so weird when it was built that a few years later they quietly removed the tower and steeple, hoping no one had ever noticed it was there. And in fact, a lot of people probably never noticed the church was there at all because, look, it was only there for 48 years before it was demolished and replaced. This building is what replaced it, and this was one of the many industrial loft buildings designed by this neighborhood's most prolific firm of architects, Cleverdon and Putzel. In the 1890s, they designed a lot of loft buildings in the neighborhood. St. Bartholomew's Church, same St. Bart's that is on Park Avenue today, was originally down here. It was right at the northeast corner of Lafayette Place and Great Jones Street, and for an even shorter period of time than the Middle Dutch Church was at 4th Street, this for only 37 years before it moved to Madison and 44th, which is where it was before it moved to Park Avenue, where it is today. Right at the corner, northwest corner of Great Jones and Lafayette Place, was the home of Peter Schermerhorn. I was once informed by no less an authority than Louis Auchincloss that in the 19th century, the name Schermerhorn was pronounced very differently. He claimed that back then, upper-class New Yorkers took great pride in slurring their words, that too sharp an enunciation indicated that perhaps you were an immigrant just learning English. And therefore, upper-class New Yorkers pronounced Schermerhorn, he told me, schmorn. Now, he could have just been kidding me. Anyway, this was the Peter Schmorn house at 6 Great Jones. This Peter Schermerhorn was the son of the Peter Schermerhorn who built Schermerhorn Row at the South Street Seaport, and this was the uncle of Carolyn Schermerhorn, the daughter of Abraham Schermerhorn, who grew up nearby on Bond Street, and then married the son of William Backhouse Astor, and became Mrs. Astor, Queen of Society. This is what replaced Peter Schermerhorn's house. This is known to some as the Schermerhorn Building, or just by its address of 376 to 380 Lafayette, designed by Henry Janeway Hardenberg, the great New York architect responsible for the Dakota and the Plaza Hotel and the original Waldorf Astoria. Hardenberg was a favorite architect of the Astor family, and through them came to the Schermerhorns and designed this loft building built by the Schermerhorn family, by the son of Peter. William C. Schermerhorn was the builder for income purposes. But it's a great example of how once upon a time, even these buildings which were really purely utilitarian were often so beautifully designed. I mean, look at some of the terracotta details on this building. They're really extraordinary. This building was not a store, it was not a great public building, it was just a loft building. And it nonetheless was a beautifully designed building. Here we see an image from the early 1900s looking north on Lafayette Street from Houston. By this time, the character of Lafayette Place was changing because the street was being extended south of Great Jones Street. It was felt that a new vehicular thoroughfare was needed, and so it was a scene for about 15 years at least. Countless buildings were demolished. And when it was extended, the name Lafayette Place was retired. It became Lafayette Street. And of course, by then, no rich people were living on Lafayette any longer. It was a street of loft buildings, primarily, interspersed with the occasional parking lot. Among the loft buildings, between Broadway and Lafayette, number 1 to 5 Bond Street, the Robbins at Appleton building by Stephen Decatur Hatch. This replaced a row of very elegant townhouses. One of the houses that this replaced had once been the home of Albert Gallatin, Treasury Secretary and principal founder of New York University. Anyway, which gives you, again, yet another example, if another example was needed, of the caliber of person who lived in the Lafayette Place neighborhood in the 30s and 40s. But by 1879 to 80, this was a neighborhood of factories and warehouses. Robbins and Appleton, by the way, was a firm of watchmakers from Waltham, Massachusetts, and in this building, they made watch cases. Beautiful cast iron building, incidentally. This was later converted into apartments. Now let's take a little stroll along Bond Street. Once upon a time, Bond Street in Manhattan had all the cachet of Bond Street, London. It was really one of the most exclusive residential streets in all of New York City. I just want to point out some of the buildings on Bond Street that have caught my eye over the years. There's 21 Bond by Buckman and Deisler, which was a very sort of workman-like architectural firm until Eli Jacques Kahn joined it and kind of made it into a high-style firm. But their works were often extremely handsome. Again, remember, this was a purely utilitarian loft building, yet with a very, very nice design. This is 24 Bond Street, 1893, also a Buckman and Deisler building, a utilitarian loft building. But these are the buildings, these loft buildings, just as was the case with those a little bit farther to the south in Soho, that commended themselves to the artists and musicians of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. And during a time of deindustrialization in New York, when factories were shutting down, and a lot of buildings like this had space available in them, artists were able to move in. They had ample space, they had good light, and that was as true of this neighborhood as it was, as I just said, of Soho, a little bit to the south. And to give you an example, when I was in college in Chicago, I remember reading about what was called the loft jazz movement in New York. The real cutting edge of jazz was taking place in concerts that musicians were putting on in their lofts in Soho and what was not yet known as NoHo. The one that was the most famous of all the jazz lofts was Studio Rivby, which was the home of the great saxophonist and shown there playing soprano saxophone and jazz innovator Sam Rivers and his wife Beatrice, which is where Rivby comes from. And at Studio Rivby, he not only performed his own concerts, but brought in musicians from all across the country, indeed all around the world, to give concerts on a continuous basis throughout the 1970s. So that it really was his loft in 24 Bond Street, really sort of like, for a few years, the epicenter of the international jazz universe. A series of albums was put out in 1976 called Wildflowers, the New York Loft Jazz Sessions. These are legendary records among jazz buffs, but they were all recorded in 24 Bond Street. And as if that weren't enough, Robert Mapplethorpe had his home and studio in 24 Bond Street, the same building as Studio Rivby. And at the same time, this is where he lived for the last 15 years of his life before he died in 1989. And there he is in a self-portrait. Well, the reason the artists were able to move onto streets like Bond Street was because those streets were, in one way of looking at things, failed streets. They had once been places where the richest New Yorkers lived. Then, after the standard 20 years, those richest New Yorkers moved on. Then most, not all, but most of their houses were torn down and replaced by loft buildings. But now those loft buildings' life cycle had come to an end. And during that time, the rents were cheap, the buildings were fairly run down, and the artists moved in. But so many artists, and often of such a caliber, that it turned this neighborhood into a great artistic mecca. And by any real reckoning of this neighborhood's fortunes, in fact, the 1970s would have to be judged this neighborhood's heyday. There were more world-famous artists and creative people living and working in this neighborhood than at any other time in the neighborhood's history. And indeed, who among us would not rate those artists of the 1970s as being greater benefactors of mankind than the rich people of the 1830s and 40s who had once lived in this neighborhood? But of course, that period too was destined to be short-lived. Because as we all know, as New Yorkers, the presence of artists in a neighborhood only betokens that that neighborhood will one day be unaffordable to artists. And in will move, you know, the employees of Goldman Sachs into buildings like 25 Bond Street, which is one of a slew of new, very high-style residential buildings being built in the neighborhood for a class of residents who are every bit as rich as those of the 1830s and 40s. This is my own favorite of the new apartment buildings. This is right across the street from us. This is 40 Bond by Herzog and de Morrone, the firm that became famous for the Ricola cough drop factory in Switzerland, and then Tate Modern and the Bird's Nest in Beijing. Winners of the Pritzker Prize, the highest prize you can be given as an architect, and for the developer Ian Schrager, they designed 40 Bond Street, a building which is certainly eye-catching. Now, at 26 Bond is a beautiful federal-style row house, which is the sort of thing that you really want to keep an eye open for in a neighborhood like this. often in these loft neighborhoods, there are still the occasional old row houses dating from the earliest phases of the neighborhood's development. In this case, a house from 1830 to 31, very similar in design to the merchant's house, but one which has been altered over the years in such a way as to provide sort of a really good comparison with this house. The glory of the merchant's house is that it has remained so incredibly intact since it was built. This one is one which has been altered with a commercial ground floor put in and various other alterations, and yet at the same time a house that does miraculously retain a number of its original elements: the dormer windows, the Gibbs surround, doorway, such as we also find here at the merchant's house, and so on. But when a house has been altered in this way, it's so easy for us, as we walk along the street, simply not to notice it. Another such house, which is with us no longer, was 31 Bond, which was the scene in 1857 of everybody's favorite neighborhood story, which was the murder of the dentist Dr. Harvey Burdell by Emma Cunningham, his inamorata, who was apparently after his fortune and who managed to get off scot-free. That was at 31 Bond, and as a result, pictures of Burdell's block of Bond Street appeared in magazines and newspapers. This was the murder of 1857. And because of that, we have a very good picture of what Bond Street looked like in the 1850s. Now, Burdell was a wealthy man, but the house, 31 Bond Street, which had recently been a single-family home, was now, in 1857, a boarding house. In fact, most of the single-family houses in the neighborhood, before they were torn down to be replaced by lofts, were converted to boarding houses. That was a very common fate for New York City row houses in the middle of the 19th century. Middle-class families and individuals were in a bind. They couldn't afford houses of their own, and they were as yet very reluctant to move into purpose-built multiple dwellings, which were associated in their minds with the tenements of the very poor. Thus, the in-between solution, and it wasn't much of a solution at all, was the boarding house. And you'll find, if you study the histories of houses in New York City, that there are precious few that at one point or other were not converted to boarding houses. Which, by the way, is better than rooming house. Rooming house is when a building is converted into, that's SRO, when poor or indigent people live in the house. Boarding houses are more respectable. Boarding house residents were often middle class, or at least shabby genteel. 50 Bond, another Cleverton and Putzel building, which I like because it uses this, as they used to say, Grecian ornamentation. I feel on the part of the architects it was a homage to the many wonderful Greek revival row houses that were being pulled down to make way for these loft buildings in a way that would have made the preservationists of the 1890s, if there were any preservationists, extremely upset. And there is an example of one of the Greek revival houses, which is with us still on these blocks, but one which has been pretty much scraped of all its identifying detail. And then right at the corner of Bond Street in the Bowery is another of the great cast iron buildings, not just of this neighborhood, but of New York City, the old Atlantic Savings Bank by Henry Engelbert, which is best known to us as the Bowery Lane Theater, because for so long, more than 30 years, it was the home of the wonderful Jean Cocteau repertory, but no longer. The building, if you go to look at it today, is enshrouded. Now let's move to Great Jones Street. And if you look at this Sanborn map, If you follow the red arrow, you see that here's Lafayette Place, right? Here's Great Jones. See, it dead ends right there. And so 17 Great Jones Street, which this arrow points to, is the house right here. Right next to it is something called Engine Company 33 on the south side of Great Jones Street. And 17 Great Jones Street is the house that in 1868, the most notorious woman in America, is the house that Victoria Claflin Woodhull moved into when she moved to New York. A native Ohioan, she was a spiritualist and a seller of patent medicines, who, after she moved to New York, managed to make the acquaintance of Commodore Vanderbilt, who was very interested in spiritualism. Commodore Vanderbilt was also very interested in Victoria's sister, Tennessee Claflin, who, from all accounts, became the Commodore's mistress. As a result, Victoria's and Tennessee's, and they lived together in the house at 17 Great Jones Street, their fortunes rose. The Commodore set up the two sisters as stockbrokers on Wall Street. They were the first female stockbrokers in New York. And they prospered tremendously, largely as a result of their association with Commodore Vanderbilt. But they weren't content simply to make money. At least Victoria was not. She was a very outspoken woman, a suffragist, but also the nation's leading advocate of what once so quaintly was called free love. And this is kind of where she ran afoul of her fellow suffragists, who wanted nothing to do with free love. You know, many of the early suffragists were really, they didn't want anything to do with sex at all. And as a result, she never kind of meshed with any of the others. And then she became an early Marxist, and the Marxists wanted nothing to do with free love. It was like the thing that she was taken with. But eventually she made a big splash by revealing in her newspaper, a weekly that she published with her sister called Woodhull's and Claflin's Weekly, she exposed the adultery of Henry Ward Beecher. In time, however, her notoriety became a bit overwhelming, and she left this country, moved to England, and lived out her years as an advocate of eugenics. So she was a fascinating woman. If we look at the Sanborn map from 1904, we see that all has changed. Here's Great Jones, but now Lafayette Street goes all the way through. Everything intervening has been demolished, and one of the things demolished was the old Engine Company 33, which then had occasion to build itself a new firehouse across the street at 42 Great Jones. Ernest Flagg and Walter Chambers' building, 1898-99, is one of my favorite buildings in New York City. I think it's just a beautifully designed building with beautiful details, beautifully intact. The greatest firehouse ever built in New York City is on Great Jones Street. Right around the corner, just one lot north of the intersection of Lafayette and Great Jones, at 381 Lafayette, is a loft building that was an industrial building, but then later became the home of the Missionary Sisters of the Immaculate Virgin of Mount St. Loretto. All books and so on say that it was an orphanage. I don't think it was. I think it was a convent lived in by the sisters who ran an orphanage elsewhere. But however that may be, the sisters in 1965 sold the building to this guy, Robert Rauschenberg, shown here in a photograph by Robert Mapplethorpe. Rauschenberg, one of the great names in 20th century art, love him or not, made his home and studio in the building on Lafayette Street. He remained really there only for about 5 years, till 1970, when he established his main studio on the Gulf Coast in Florida, but he never gave up the building on Lafayette Street, and in fact, today it is the home of the Rauschenberg Foundation. And among the series of lithographs that he produced in that building was homage to Frederick Kiesler, the New York architect, though shown here gazing at the Israel Museum Shrine of the Book that he designed in Jerusalem. Across the street at the corner was the late lamented Jones Diner, said by many to be sort of a perfect example of its genre. Classic New York diner, which opened, you'll read sometimes on the internet that it opened in the 1920s. Somebody states authoritatively 38, but actual records indicate 1940. And it closed in 2002 when the site was purchased, and there was much wailing and gnashing of teeth when Jones Diner closed. But, you know, why? Why the wailing? Who would rather there not be an empty lot instead of Jones Diner? Because that's what's been there ever since 2002. It's just been an empty lot. Whoever wants to build on it hasn't gotten his act together, apparently. I don't know the details. I'm sure some of you do. But in any event, wow. Now, let's just move north as we make our way toward the end to Astor Place. The building that during the first residential heyday of this neighborhood stood right at Astor Place, almost opposite Lafayette Street, was the old Astor Place Opera House. Astor Place Opera House opened in 1847. Like the Middle Dutch Church, it was designed by the Boston Greek revivalist Isaiah Rogers. It was a lovely building and said by everyone to be a fine house for music. It was praised by Richard Grant White and Walt Whitman, Washington Irving. And here we see another photograph of it with the name Clinton Hall, because it was the Astor Place Opera House, the city's principal venue for opera, before the Academy of Music was built on 14th Street, for only a very short time. Then it was taken over by an organization called the Mercantile Library, a private library that was founded in 1820 and that had, since 1830, been located at Nassau and Beekman Streets. They then, in 1850, moved into the Astor Place Opera House and remained on this site until 1933, when they moved to East 47th Street, where they are today. As you all know, the Astor Place Opera House is most famous or infamous because of the very strange riot that took place outside of it on May 10th, 1849, in which more than 20 people were killed, making it one of the worst, deadliest riots in our history. And what makes the riot a little bit strange is that it was a riot that was brought about by fans of rival Shakespearean actors. And you know, you gotta really be careful with these Shakespeare fans. They can just get out of hand. Before you know it, 20 people are dead and there's like $1 million worth of property damage. It was actually, as historians love to point out to us, about class resentments. There were fans of Edwin Forrest, the idol of the Bowery. And this reminds us that the Bowery theater goers of the day, 1849, often went to see Shakespeare. But the English actor William Charles Macready, the friend of Dickens, who'd been brought in by the grandees with their boxes at the Astor Place Opera House to do a proper English Shakespeare for the New York upper class, was the object of tremendous resentment among working class New Yorkers who were determined when he appeared at the Astor Place Opera House to disrupt his performances, to create a great nuisance outside, and this unfortunately escalated. I do like to think of it as the 1849 version of the East Coast, West Coast rap wars. In 1890 to 92, the Mercantile Library decided to tear down the old Astor Place Opera House building and replace it with a bigger building that would be income producing. 21 Astor Place, the building which is there today. The Mercantile Library, which by the way was a library, a private library that was founded in order to serve the needs of merchants' clerks. Keep them out of trouble. The Mercantile Library occupied the 6th and 7th floors of this building, and the rest of it was rented out for other uses. After the Mercantile Library moved uptown, this then became the home of District 65, the labor union. And it remained in this building until it went under in 1993, and the building is now partly residential. But look at this picture of the Astor Place Opera House. This is very interesting. This is the only picture that I know of that shows the old Murray Street Presbyterian Church when it was on 8th Street. And again, if anybody here knows of other pictures of this, please let me know. This is an interesting church. Beautiful church. Federal style church, built 1811 to 12 on Murray Street, downtown, near City Hall, by the great John McComb Jr. When its congregation had, gone uptown, they decided to bring their church with them. They disassembled it and reassembled it. So it's exactly the same building which was on Murray Street, transplanted to 8th Street. That's how you used to do preservation in New York. Eventually, the Presbyterian congregation left it. It became St. Anne's Roman Catholic Church. That's the St. Anne's that later moved to East 12th Street, to that church, only the facade of which now stands in front of an NYU dorm. And then this became a theater, eventually a theater called the Germania Theater. And then along came John Wanamaker. He tore down more than half of LaGrange Terrace, and he tore down the old Murray Street Presbyterian Church in order to build the Wanamaker Annex, that gigantic building, which has like 1.5 million square feet of floor area. It's huge and covered entirely in terracotta, and what's the word? The AIA guide calls it stolid. As indeed it is, although back when it was part of the John Wanamaker department store, it had marvelous interiors. It was designed, after all, by D.H. Burnham and Company, who designed Marshall Fields in Chicago and Selfridges in London. This is a great picture. Looking to the south, there's Grace Church, built in 1846. And then this is the old A.T. Stewart store, the cast iron building at Broadway and 10th Street, where the Stewart House apartments now are. This lays claim, according to the historian I trust the most, Gunther Barth, to be the first true department store in history. 1862, the A.T. Stewart store. Then, long after A.T. Stewart was dead, John Wanamaker bought the store, and it became Wanamaker's. But feeling that he needed to build a little addition to it, he then assembled the block immediately to its south and built the Wanamaker Annex. And Wanamaker operated out of both. Eventually, the A.T. Stewart store, shortly before it was scheduled to be demolished, burnt down and was replaced by the white brick apartment building that is there now. Right at the intersection of Astor Place and Lafayette, we see that in this old photograph by Rudy Burkhardt, the famous Coke sign was there for a long time, and now what's there is 445 Lafayette Street, the Wathmey Seagull designed undulating glass tower, which again reminds us of the sorts of changes which have, of recent years, overcome the neighborhood. And I'd be remiss if I did not say a quick word about Cooper Union. This is another very Germanic building, Rundbogen-style building, like the Astor Library, and like the Astor design by a German architect, Friedrich Petersen, in this case, from Prussia. And this is what Cooper Union originally looked like. As you can see, it actually was originally a mildly good-looking building. But then it had all of these sort of alterations made to it in the 1880s and beyond, and the building kind of took on its present kind of awkward lumpen appearance. But in recent years, it has been surrounded by some very, very glitzy new buildings, including one by the Pritzker Prize-winning Japanese architect Fumihiko Maki, also the architect of 4 World Trade Center, which is open. And there's this, and there's, you know, this. The building. Oh, Tom Main is a Pritzker Prize winner. So our little slice of NoHo has buildings by not 1, not 2, but by 3 Pritzker Prize winners. In fact, how many places in the world are there Pritzker Prize buildings, 3 of them in such close proximity? Yet I wonder, I'm just wondering, I'm not making any judgments or stating any opinions, but I'm just curious if there are people in this room who would feel the loss if, say, none of those buildings was there. Just wondering. And this is a building that was not designed by a Pritzker Prize winner, but it is, as we said in the description for this talk, has sort of stood stalwart witness to these changes that have come over the neighborhood. It's kind of an amazing thing when you think about this house, how intact it is, how gloriously and anomalously intact this house is, that it should be sort of right in the middle of this neighborhood that has been a kind of boiling cauldron of change for 150 years, from its earliest residential heyday in the 1830s to today. There are few neighborhoods anywhere that have failed to stand still, as this one has failed to stand still. And yet, 29 East 4th Street is here. And if landmarks have any meaning at all in our lives, I think that this exemplifies that meaning more so than any other single house in New York City. And thus, in this year of the 50th anniversary of the Landmarks Law, one of the things that I think we should be thinking about, really what should be at the very top of the list, is the fate of this house. Going forward, we really, really have to ensure that this house survives and is left undamaged, and that it continues to receive the tender, loving care that it has received, and continues to present so many great programs. Thank you.